Gender studies. Never before has there been a more ridiculed collegiate field of exploration than gender studies. The very idea of this field has become little more than a go-to caricature of the ideological utility of the useless liberal snowflake activist. But why? Why has the idea of studying gender become so conflated with the ridiculous extremes of the far-left ideology? I will attempt to delve into this question through an analysis of my own personal experiences while obtaining a gender studies minor with my degree. First, what is gender studies really? Well, that in itself is already a fairly complicated question. In my opinion, gender studies should be the exploration of how individuals' sex, gender expression, sexual orientation, and so on interact, influence, and motivate behaviors and perceptions. Effectively, what are the root causes and effects of masculine and feminine behavior and cognition? However, in reality, the idea of gender studies ultimately evolved from women's studies courses that became increasingly popular during the sexual revolution of the 60s. And while you can still find women's studies courses at a significant number of colleges and universities, gender studies appears to make an effort to both be more objective and include explorations of not only femininity, but also masculinity, and furthermore what is known as, quote, queer studies, which to me seems pretty self-explanatory. One of the major criticisms of the idea of gender studies versus women's studies is the idea that gender studies is, effectively, just women's studies with a different name. And then this idea then becomes further reinforced by the notion that women's studies, and therefore gender studies, are effectively courses in feminist narrative and ideology. My own research has shown that many critics perceive that the feminist influence that is pervasive throughout gender studies programs is a form of ideological indoctrination rather than a form of education. And overall, again, based on my own personal experience in the program that I was in, I feel that I was most definitely introduced to this feminist ideology, but I wouldn't go so far as to claim indoctrination. And this leads us to my experiences in the program. First, we'll start with why I elected to take up gender studies in the first place, and for that, I'll need to explain the context of where I was at the time as far as my education. I had just gotten out of the U.S. Navy and was attending college to obtain a degree in psychology. To this point, I was relatively uninterested in the social political landscape or any arguments associated with it. Overall, what I was truly interested in was the science of romantic and sexual dynamics within the social world. How do relationships work? What makes individuals sexually attracted to one another? Why do some marriages seem to last 60 years while others can't seem to last 60 days without collapse? Why do people engage in infidelity? And so on like that. And this fascination began when I was in my early teens, as I continuously observed the newfound sexuality of various groups and individuals within my high school environment, and continues to be an intense personal interest to this day. Therefore, throughout many of my initial general education courses in college, I tended to focus on this personal interest throughout my writing and my research. Eventually, I was introduced to a professor within my psychology department who had studied sexuality for her PhD, and whom also instructed in the psychology of sexuality courses at the college. Myself and this professor discussed the idea of me taking on a gender studies minor, and eventually she became my student advisor for the remainder of my undergraduate studies. And honestly, the concept of an entire discipline based around the study of masculine, feminine dynamics, sexuality, and gender was very appealing to me, and I signed up without much hesitation. So now that the context is established, what did I actually learn in my gender studies courses? First, I learned that the hallmark of gender studies as a discipline is that it's interdisciplinary. Second, I discovered that what you learn in these courses depends a great deal on context. And overall, this meant studying other disciplines like biology, literature, religion, or psychology within the paradigm of gender and sexuality. For example, in a gender and literature course, we were assigned readings based on feminine-focused, masculine-focused, or queer-focused themes within the novels. We were asked to analyze these larger themes of sexuality and gender within the context of the story, and then draw comparisons to the real world. For example, we read Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club and discussed the various social forms, behaviors, and expectations of the masculine role in society and how men might achieve or fail to achieve the ideal. Similar readings and analyses were conducted through a femininity and queer theory lens using a variety of different literary texts. Ultimately, I found the course to be quite enjoyable, as interesting conclusions can be drawn by analyzing literature in this type of philosophical way. Next, in the Psychology of Sex and Gender course, I was more at odds with myself, particularly with psychology being my primary field of study. This course, day by day, appeared to find a foundation less in psychology and more on certain specific topics within the realm of sex and gender, although these topics were often accompanied by readings of scientific literature. For example, one day might involve an introduction to trans people and how they navigate the world. The next, how swingers might maintain a relationship without the interference of jealousy. And still next, we might have a debate or a discussion on the potential overuse of unnecessary C-sections during childbirth. Furthermore, the course seemed to have a second parallel focus on sex education and how individuals are introduced to and taught to think about sex and sexual behavior within their social and cultural environment. And overall, I would argue that this psychology course might be better considered a collegiate-level, objective sex education course, more than anything else. As a final example, my, quote, Introduction to Gender Studies course may have been the most interesting, in my opinion. Rather than having a professor just teach gender studies for an entire semester, professors from other departments within the humanities and sciences were invited to lecture on their specialty within the context of a gender studies course. So, a genetic biologist came and lectured on the nature of the XY chromosomes, various chromosomal disorders that can come from that, and delved into the concept of things like reproductive investment, which was quite fascinating to me. Still further, a historian who specializes in the Holocaust discussed how women in the lowest classes and resistance movements manipulated and dominated the sexual marketplace in exchange for various necessities or information or what have you. A sports and fitness expert came and discussed the effect of sports on the development of gender roles and the benefits and drawbacks of sex-separated versus sex-integrated professional sports. And so on like that through various other disciplines. And overall, each lecture came with it a presentation where individual students could present on relevant topics and follow-up discussions might be had. These presentations are where the feminist ideological narrative was, in my opinion, most present, though not exclusively, within my gender studies courses. Which brings us to the controversies, the debates. Things like the gender wage gap, the pink tax, campus rape statistics, disparate numbers of women and men in positions of power, and so forth, so on and so forth. These discussions were fairly frequent when the circumstance called for them. However, they were, for the most part, dialectics and not debates. For example, when the wage gap was brought up, I was fully able to voice my concerns and questions and perhaps counter-arguments regarding the concept without being shouted down for just being a patriarchal male that just couldn't possibly understand. That just didn't happen. One of the more interesting and heated discussions that I took part in was why women wear makeup. And I find this interesting now because Dr. Jordan Peterson brought this up relatively recently. And I made the argument that women wear makeup to appear more attractive, which is fairly simple in my view. And a significant number of women in the room appeared to become defensive, making more or less the argument of, quote, I wear makeup for me because it makes me feel good. And to me, this response still begged the question of why wearing makeup made these young women feel more positively about themselves. And the logical conclusion that I could reach is that though you may wear makeup to feel more confident as an end goal, the effect comes from the notion that you, recognizing yourself as being more attractive, comes from an expectation that you'll be perceived as more attractive by others. So, I was able to voice this, and after expanding on my initial point and moving through this logical thought process in my mind, the others in the room who had originally contested my claim of, quote, you wear makeup so that you appear more attractive, seemed to ultimately, if not reluctantly, agree with my assessment. Overall, I feel that I was very able to engage in these discussions respectfully and without any kind of vitriol from either side of the dialectic, with one glaring exception, the friend zone. I'm not going to comment on that here because I've already done a short video on it, but that one kind of baffled me. So what about all the other controversies that are floating around out there? Well, let's hit the big one that I see. Intersectionality. I was most definitely introduced to intersectionality and was often asked to view things through an intersectional lens. However, the way intersectionality was introduced to me was that it is a tool with which to classify individuals with regard to their individual experiences. For example, in a counseling setting or in the context of a teacher working with a student, it's important to understand the social, psychological, and ideological, cultural contexts from which the person across from you is coming. I'm going to engage with an ex-gang member from Southside Chicago differently than I'm going to engage with the Dean of Sciences at my college. I'm going to engage with both of them differently than I would engage with a rape victim that I'm trying to help. Effectively, as I've heard people claim, I was taught that the ultimate end form of the, quote, progressive stack, colloquially, or the lattice of intersections, if you prefer, is the individual, and thus to view individuals as unique individuals with their own unique experiences. The notion of privilege versus oppression with respect to intersectionality came up at times within other coursework, most notably my social psychology courses, but from my experience it was not utilized as a cudgel to, quote, smash the patriarchy or other, quote, oppressive groups. In short, never once was I told to my face to check my privilege. In all honesty, as a cisgendered, heterosexual white male, I felt very welcome in these contexts, particularly with respect to the activist work that I elected to engage in. It is difficult to exist in higher education these days without engaging in some form of activism, and I chose sex education, consent education, and sexual assault prevention as my particular worthy causes. I've seen some people argue that this type of thing is foolish, as the statistics that are commonly used on college campuses to reflect rape and sexual assault, for example, the 1 in 4 women are raped on college campuses per year, etc., are effectively bunk. Now, I completely recognize this fact. I have thoroughly read the research and relevant statistical analyses, and I completely agree that this is misinformation. And I don't care. The way I see it is that if I helped one single person understand a little better when they might be about to engage in sexual activity without consent, or help someone use their words when they didn't want something to happen, or help someone know where to go if they were assaulted, or help someone find the courage to report an assault, then I have succeeded. 1 in 4 or 1 in 10,000 makes no difference to me. I might have helped someone. For me, it's kind of like people who raise awareness or charity for diseases that relatively few people suffer from. Just because it might not occur that often, or people are giving out false statistics, doesn't make helping people with the problem any less important, in my opinion. So where am I now? What use was this gender studies coursework to me? Well, I'm making YouTube videos in my basement about the root motivations of toxically masculine behavior. I'm trying to figure out why the counterpoint of toxic femininity is so easily discarded in mainstream discourse. I'm continuously engaging in independent research projects to expand my breadth of knowledge on the topic and find answers to difficult questions. So, in effect, not much. However, I personally view the gender studies program I attended as similar to other humanities that ask big questions, like philosophy. Many people claim that a degree in philosophy is equally useless, or art, or theater. And I believe that this sentiment comes from a place of kind of a lack of productivity and earning potential. However, without philosophy, we wouldn't have the breathtaking array of ideas that exist in the social landscape today. Without art, we wouldn't have the music, paintings, books, comic books, video games that millions of people enjoy every day. Without theater, Marvel wouldn't be raking in billions of dollars each year. And without gender studies, whether you want to call it that, or sex research, or the science of sexuality, or any number of other interchangeable titles, in some form or another, we wouldn't have the deep and nuanced understanding of how feminine and masculine characteristics are so very important to how we as human animals engage with the world around us. After I graduated and I started down this path of independent research, I had hoped that it might lead to something substantial, and it did. Sort of. In an effort to sate my need for intellectual stimulation, I discovered that the kind of objective approach to sex and gender with the feminist ideology laid on the table rather than shoved down my throat was most definitely not the acceptable narrative within the wider social landscape, at least online. I found a significant amount of vitriol, socially acceptable hatred of men, supplicating male feminists that seem to enjoy being under the boot heel of the, quote, oppressed female feminists, and a constant barrage of collectivist outrage. There is a culture war waging in cyberspace, and I happened to stumble onto the battlefield in innocent naivete. I asked questions, and from the feminists was berated for being born the way I am. I've been called a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe, a Nazi. It was no better on the other side either, where I was berated for the questions I asked. I was called a beta male, a soy boy, a cuck. This inability for either rhetorical point of view to engage in intellectually honest discourse is, to me, disheartening at the best of times. So I ask you, dear listener, is objectivity dead? Have we been relegated to this useless, tribalistic, unprincipled state of discourse where the fringe political extremes viciously claw at each other with buzzwords and canned character attacks? Where a question as simple as, why do you believe that gender is a social construct, cannot be asked in good faith because insurmountable paranoia sees the enemy or heresy in those words. Where the question of, well, why is it that mostly men commit violent crime or start wars or shoot up schools, is met with hashtag whataboutism and a form of ridicule that only manifests as an attack on my masculinity. Is there a reasonable center? Can anyone show me to the DMZ of this battleground where I can have an open and honest conversation with individuals of all kinds? If we can't find one, I'm very, very worried that rationality and objectivity will be slaughtered. Unfortunate collateral damage. Casualties of the culture war. I'd like to take a moment to respectfully and from the bottom of my heart thank my gender studies professors, advisors, and mentors. From what I've seen, you were better to me in those classrooms than many might have been simply for being what I am. I know that you will continue to do for your students what you did for me, even if they're a pain in the ass sometimes. For all of you out there, sincerely, as fellow human beings, I love you guys. Be good to each other.